Well, good morning. Thank you all for being here. I'm A.G. Harmon, the Associate Dean of Bench and Bar Programs at the Columbus School of Law at the Catholic University of America. On behalf of myself, my colleague, Professor Marshall Brieger, who has coordinated this event with me, our Dean, Stephen Payne, and all here at Catholic Law, we appreciate your attendance. 8 months ago, we conceived this undertaking in response to a phenomenon breaking across the culture and the academy at large, but with a keen and peculiarly acute impact on American law schools, where confrontation with opposing viewpoints and the formulation of civil reasoned responses is central to the training to be undergone. Further, and more profoundly, the trend is in direct opposition to the First Amendment and indeed to the educational enterprise itself. The phenomenon of which I speak is, of course, the refusal under many supposed justification to allow for dialogue and debate. This refusal has taken many forms and has had and will have serious repercussions for law students, law school faculties, legal practitioners, and even the judiciary. While vigorous debate and even heated dialogue is central to law, the new interdiction of certain speakers, certain arguments, certain positions, and even certain clients is antithetical to what American law has always meant and should mean. Therefore, this symposium has a clear mandate. First, to help determine the causes of the current phenomenon, that is, what has brought us to this pass. Second, to help identify the effects that this phenomenon is having upon legal education and practice. And finally, third, to discuss and posit serious solutions to the problem for both law schools and the profession itself. All right, so I'll now turn the floor over to Stephen Payne, our Dean, and Knights of Columbus Professor of Law, who will come forward to provide his own welcome. Dean Payne.
Thank you, AG, and welcome to our school. It's great to have everybody here. Thank you in particular to Professor Harmon and you as well, Professor Brieger, our dedicated staff here at the Columbus School of Law, many of whom helped bring this event to life. And it's a critical time to do it, I think. Today's symposium on free speech and civility in American law schools is part of Catholic Law's First Amendment initiatives, which is a set of annual programs dedicated to providing a collegial forum that fosters debate, dialogue, and study of First Amendment issues from all sides. These programs include, first, the Siegenthaler-Sutherland Cup First Amendment Moot Court Competition, now in its 75th year, which is the oldest moot court competition of its kind in the nation. The event welcomes up to 30 teams from around the country in a 2-day contest that requires competitors to argue both sides of a First Amendment problem drafted by our moot court board. The second, the Siegenthaler-Sutherland debates, the Siegenthaler debates, which is a moderated debate between two First Amendment scholars regarding a topical First Amendment issue that's held annually. Third, the Judicial Clerkship Opinion Writing Conference, the brilliant brainchild of Professor A.G. Harmon, which welcomes rising federal and state appellate court clerks to a 3-day conference in which members of the judiciary review and critique conferees' drafts of opinions on a First Amendment issue and instruct them on the finer points of judicial opinion drafting. And fourth, our Center for Religious Liberty, a law school center dedicated to the study and articulation of the Catholic approach to religious liberty as a fundamental human right for all persons, regardless of faith, which is co-directed by Bill Saunders and our own Professor Mark Rienzi, who's here with us today. Catholic law is proud to take the fore in this domain, which is so fundamental to the rule of law and the functioning of a pluralistic society. I'm particularly proud to be the dean of a community of students and scholars who are universally dedicated to convening civil discourse on important and even controversial topics. We've always been an institution of learning that is willing to have hard conversations while treating each other, regardless of background, with kindness, respect, and professionalism. Just in the last couple of weeks, we've had events on Jewish women lawyers under the Third Reich, a commemoration of Kristallnacht, a healthcare conference discussing brain death and end-of-life issues, and a debate about abortion. So it's not as if we're trying to avoid controversy. And our students, I'm particularly proud of, some of whom are in the room today, really uphold, I think, the finest tradition in the nation of treating our guests with hospitality and respect. Finally, we want to thank the Academic Freedom Alliance and its Director of Operations, Howard Muncie, as well as everyone at the Knight Foundation for their generous sponsorship of this program. We're deeply grateful for their commitment to the ideals for which our symposium stands and for their help that made this event possible. I'll now turn the floor over to Professor Marshall Brieger of our faculty to introduce our first group of speakers. And again, I offer you our welcome.
Thanks very much. This is a startup panel, and we want to talk about the causes, what in the culture, what changes in the culture and in academic institutions have brought us to where we are today. And there's no one better to start this conversation than Greg Lukianoff, the president and CEO of FIRE, the Foundation for Individual Rights and Expression. When he took over, FIRE was a small group. It's boomed in the last years. I don't know if it's because of his ability or because of the problems have boomed. But be that as it may, it is the major force for protection of free speech rights of students and of faculty in this country. And they're active on innumerable fronts. He's also a prolific author, really focusing in on what it is in American culture that's changed, that's resulted in a kind of diminution of the value of speech. His new book, The Canceling of the American Mind, it's just come out. It's selling so fast that he couldn't even give me a copy to wave around to you. But he's also written Unlearning Liberty, Campus Censorship, and the End of American Debate, The Coddling of the American Mind, How Good Intentions and Bad Ideas Are Setting Up a Generation for Failure, and numerous other books, movies, and activities that promote the value of free speech. So I'm delighted that Greg Lukianoff will join us. Greg, PowerPoint. Thank you.
Here we go. Thank you so much for having me. Good to see you. I have recently been informed that there are now threats to campus, threats to free speech on campus, that people are now getting in trouble for their opinions on campus. I've gotten a lot of calls from media lately about the bad events for freedom of speech that have taken place since October 7th, particularly focused on pro-Palestinian speech. And of course, FIRE is defending all of these organizations. But reading things that seem to pretend that there hasn't been a problem since, I mean, there was one Politico article that basically said since 9/11, actually showing very little knowledge of what the data is about what happened after 9/11. I started actually right after 9/11 at FIRE. And going back to the McCarthyism, one I really, I'm going to be showing, the worst years I've seen for academic freedom and free speech on campus were 2020 and 2021, by a substantial margin. So this is my new book, Canceling of the American Mind. I do try to reach a mass audience, so even though it's got a flashy title and a cool GIF, I hope you will actually give it a read because there's a ton of data and examples in there as well, some of which has not reached a large audience. So defining terms. My definition of cancel culture is very similar to a standard definition of censorship. And we talk about we define it as the uptick beginning around 2014 and accelerating in 2017 and after of campaigns to get people disinvited, fired, deplatformed, or otherwise punished for speech that is or would be protected by First Amendment standards. Here we're making an analogy to public employee law to bring in a great deal of nuance and common sense to a definition that we hope to keep relatively short, if inelegant. And the climate of fear and conformity that has resulted from this uptick. This was not a subtle shift on campus. Prior to 2014, we had seen students be some of the best constituencies for free speech on campus, and that changed very fast and very dramatically around the end of 2013, beginning in 2014. It tends to, unfortunately, follow Generation Z hitting campus. However, I don't seek to just blame Generation Z. It's largely because administrators who had already been a major threat to academic freedom and free speech on campus, not all, but some, in many cases would work with students to lead to shoutdowns, deplatforming, and leading the charge and getting professors fired in many cases. This is why some of the talk about eliminating bureaucratization in higher ed that's sometimes treated as a threat to academic freedom itself is silly, because when it comes to a lot of the threats we've seen to academic freedom and free speech on campus, they come from the giant, expensive, and growing campus bureaucracy. So I'm going to open with this very remedial lesson that I now have to do when I even speak on college campuses. This is what I believe young people are taught today about freedom of speech. They are taught that freedom of speech is exclusively the argument of the bully, the bigot, and the robber baron. And I have to show up and explain that no, actually, wealthy and powerful people, robber barons, have always done historically well because they are wealthy and powerful. They are protected by those facts. And in a democracy, if you have 51% of the vote, the bully and the bigot gets to decide the law. You literally only need a separate protection for freedom of speech for minority points of view. That's one of the reasons why some of the best proponents of freedom of speech have themselves been minorities. John Lewis, who used to live in my neighborhood, and I got to see him every so often, would argue that without freedom of speech, the civil rights movement would have been a bird without wings. All of these are famous defenders of freedom of speech and freedom of the press. The reason why you don't hear quite as much about this on campus is partially because when you're the man, when you're actually in charge, freedom of speech starts looking like a problem. And rather than actually associate yourself with power, and these institutions, I think it's collectively a business of about $1 trillion a year, would rather actually make the argument that no, actually it's the powerful who demand free speech, not the other way around. It's something that we take on quite a bit in our book, Canceling the American Mind. So this is what I really should, in future conferences, what I think I'm going to open up with instead is the decrease in viewpoint diversity among the professorate going from about 1950s up. Campuses have always leaned to the left. It was about 2-to-1, 3-to-1 in the 1950s and 60s. But now you're actually dealing with departments that have literally no conservatives in them in many cases, and this is not an exaggeration. In a lot of humanities departments, the Marxists literally outnumber the number of conservatives. This is by their self-defined conservative or Marxist. Now, this kind of political homogeneity should lead to a period of nobody getting in trouble for their speech, because there are so many mechanisms, even in the hiring process, in the admissions process, through the bias-related incident program, literally hotlines you can call to report your professors and your students for offensive speech, which, when we've done the polling, what they mean by offensive speech are wrong opinions, which utterly terrified me the last time when I looked at the data at our conference this past year. So there shouldn't really be anybody getting in trouble for speech on campus. And what we found, unfortunately, is that there still are, and that the worst year we've ever seen was 2020 and 2021 in terms of attempts to get professors fired. Why do attempts matter? Do students have the right to demand that their professors be fired? Yes, of course they do. But to deny that right would be to say that students should be punished for trying to deplatform people or trying to get the professors fired. I do not believe that students should be punished for that. But if you don't understand that if you have a campus in which a normal reaction to professors you argue with or you dislike is to try to get them fired, which is historically, by the way, extremely unusual. I've been doing this for 22 years. It was only around 2013, 2014 that I started seeing students demanding that professors be fired for what they say in class and for their opinion. Not that it never happened, that's why we refer to it as an uptick, it just happened very rarely. And the acceleration of students being involved in demanding that professors be fired began around 2017. And don't let the attempts to say, oh, fire's just blaming the students. No, we're not. In many cases, the people who are helping this along are administrators, actually hired people. And I'll give some examples of who work for universities to the detriment of academic freedom and free speech. So 1 in 6, so we also know that's a wild undercount, by the way, because 1 in 6 professors report having been disciplined or threatened with discipline for their speech. 1 in 6. That means that pretty much every professor is going to know someone who has been disciplined or threatened with discipline for their speech. These are remarkable numbers, and I've been dealing in a situation where people have a very poor knowledge of the historical threats to freedom of speech on campus, somehow trying to minimize this as not being a big deal. This is a crazy percentage of people. There's a huge number of professors. And you should also be concerned about this issue because it's concentrated at the top. That the most influential schools in the country, by and large, have the worst environment for freedom of speech, the highest levels of deplatforming, professor cancellations, and student cancellations. The top 10 schools in the country account for something like 13% of all cancellation attempts. And in the top, only 80 schools account, and they're all of which are in the top 200 schools in the country, account for about half of the attempts to get professors fired. Now, sometimes I try to reassure people who want to see this strictly in a culture war lens that about 1/3 of the successful attempts to get professors fired initially start on the right. They start with Fox News. They start with Turning Point USA, for example. Usually the actual punishments are carried out by administrators on the left because there's very few administrators actually on the right to begin with. But nonetheless, I explain that a lot of these threats come from the right, and we've been fighting these since my very first letter at FIRE. And of course, if suddenly knowing that the threats come from the right as well makes you care and gives you respect for this issue, you might suddenly have more respect for FIRE, but I lose all respect for someone who needs that reassurance. You should care about it even when it's not on your team. So the top ranked national universities make up 13% of all targeting. We talk in the book about perfect rhetorical fortress. This is actually, a lot of the book is a critique about the way we argue, cancel culture just being the most vicious way that we prevent people from actually disagreeing with each other by scaring them that they'll lose their career or livelihood. But we talk about all the different mechanisms that are actually used to not have substantive conversations. A very popular one on campus that we now see everywhere in social media is using the demographic funnel. We give examples of this in the book, of examples of people being dismissed for their race, for their sexuality, for being cisgendered, et cetera, as a way of basically not having to engage them in a debate. And we worked out that you get down to about 0.9% of the population doesn't fit within this demographic funnel. You'd be left with about 0.9% of the population. Now, you can get rid of that entire rest of the population by simply dubbing them conservative, which, if you'll notice, the fact that recently scholars dubbing the ACLU, a scholar, dubbing the ACLU and the New York Times neo-Confederates, apparently calling them far right wasn't enough, is one of the weapons of choice of dismissing whether or not you should listen to somebody. So you get to 100% of the population pretty quickly. But here's the funny thing. It turns out that even if you make it through that 0.9% and magically somehow are not dubbed conservative for your opinion, or your opinion considered right adjacent, or again, neo-Confederate is apparently the new fun way to dismiss people, and you have a non-conforming opinion, you get it even worse. And we have many examples of people saying, oh, okay, well, I am actually trans, and I am actually non-white, and I've been told that I have internalized misogyny, internalized transphobia, and internalized racism, and that's why my opinion doesn't conform. So actually, it gets worse in many cases for people who actually argue. So what you start realizing is this is a system for protecting dogma. It should be anathema to higher education, but instead, a lot of these tactics are tolerated and even taught. I got a great quote from Coleman Hughes, who points out that he's often told that essentially one of the key factors in taking him seriously is the color of his skin on certain topics. But he's been told repeatedly that when he has an opinion that doesn't conform to what people think it should be, he's told he's actually not black. And I talked to basically every conservative black author that I knew and a number of moderate black authors that I knew. They'd all been told that they had been told, including John McWhorter, including Wilfred Riley, that they're not really black because of their opinions, and usually by white people. We talk about the various tactics we use to actually win arguments without actually winning arguments. We call the obstacle course standard, standard legal, I'm an atheist, but I like to bless people. We talk about the obstacle course, typical logical fallacies, the minefield ones that are actually more particular to social media, Hypocrisy projection has become really important now because it's one of the primary ways that people try to win arguments without winning arguments on social media, which is to immediately jump on social media when there's a case that reflects their politics. And this is always done by someone who only cares about one side of the political fence. And this does happen on the right and the left, by the way. Saying, well, where's fire on this case? Where are the Harper's Letters people on this case? Where are the free speech people on this case? Without having actually oftentimes read the link that they've sent around to discover that we are literally quoted in the fifth line of the piece. Hypocrisy projection is just assuming that everybody else must be a hypocrite. And do these people actually correct their beliefs on it? Generally, no. We talk about the efficient rhetorical fortress. This is the one on the right. This one, we call it efficient. Because it's simple, but it's very effective at eliminating having to listen to people that you really should. This allows you to dismiss people who are who you can dub liberal or woke. Journalists, experts, even if they're on the right, you can again magically say that they're woke, or people who oppose Donald Trump. People might be surprised that in coddling the American mind, we get orders of magnitude more hate mail from pro-Trump people than anybody else about the book, because apparently we were unfair in how we discussed the president in discussing Charlottesville. So to give an example, Carol Hooven at Harvard University, I think, is a good one for two distinct reasons. She wrote a book. She's an evolutionary biologist. She went on TV to talk about her book, T, which is about testosterone. And she made the argument that in terms of transgender, we should be kind, we should be compassionate, we should use their pronouns, but we can't pretend that biological sex is not real. That's dangerous to science, that's dangerous to policy if we actually do start trying to convince ourselves of this. And immediately, a DEI administrator at Harvard started calling her out for this, which immediately led to petitions to get her fired. Which led to students boycotting being a TA for a class, which was one of the things that was leading to the excuse, essentially, to get her to leave Harvard. And she also had friends abandon her. What should have happened here is the president of Harvard and the leadership should have said, you know what, here we have to actually, we're a marketplace of ideas, we need to actually defend the right to disagree on this radioactive issue, one of the most radioactive issues at very elite colleges today. But very few professors or friends actually did. Some of the exceptions include people like Steve Pinker. She eventually got so depressed by literally friends turning on her that she decided to drop out of Harvard. She came back briefly, decided to leave again more recently. Now, this is sad for her. It's a very sad story. But it's also devastating to the credibility of higher education and faith in experts overall. Why? Because the public isn't actually stupid. And when they look at these kind of cases and they say to themselves, okay, now Scientific American is trying to tell me that biological sex is on a spectrum. Why should I believe them when the last person who said otherwise, even though she was a Harvard professor, got forced out at Harvard? This is utterly destructive to faith and opinion, even if it happens of experts, even happened once. But as you see, we talk about 1,000 different examples of it having that we know of, which we know is a wild undercount. Yeah, and that's one of the major themes of it. Harvard absolutely earned its last place position on our free speech ranking this year. It was kind of amusing to be called out by some Harvard folks about our methodology, which, by the way, Nate Silver analyzed this past week and was like, oh, this is really rigorous data. Because we based it on, and it was kind of funny. They just gave me an opportunity when they said, oh, like it's just some kind of stunt. Harvard couldn't possibly be the worst. And it's like, okay, have you noticed that Harvard has always finished at the bottom of the list all the previous years? And as we got more accurate and we had more data, they did worse and worse. But this is based on the largest study of student opinion ever conducted, 55,000 students. This is based on the largest database of student cancellation, professor cancellation, speech codes, and deplatforming ever put together. So they really did earn their place as dead last. By the way, the next schools were University of Pennsylvania was second to last, Georgetown third to last, and just to point out how data doesn't always work out the way people expect it to, University of South Carolina was fourth to last. The only elite colleges that did particularly well were University of Virginia, so good for them. University of Chicago did quite well, but for the most part, these are schools that are technological colleges that did well. And I think that if you really wanted to send a message to some of these schools, telling them that actually I'm sending my kids to Michigan Technological University, which finished #1, then sending them to Harvard or Yale, I think that might actually get their attention. I talk about my friend Mike Adams, who killed himself after being canceled in 2020. 76% of applicants dismissed on the basis of DEI statements alone. I think it's particularly shocking that during a period of unprecedented professor cancellations, that universities are now pursuing DEI statements. About half of the large schools in the country now have these. It's moving up to more like 75%. And we did an experiment to prove this, but hopefully for intelligent people, you don't have to prove it because it's just so obvious. A DEI statement, a requirement of a DEI statement is a political litmus test, just as much as having a statement on whether or not, what your feelings are about patriotism, if this was asked in the 1950s, would be a political litmus test. FIRE has actually even sponsored legislation to make sure that political litmus tests are not used in hiring and higher ed. But the idea that there was too much freedom of thought, too much heterogeneity in the professorates, that we need actually a further culling device is one of the reasons why it's hard to be very optimistic about the future of higher ed at the moment. And the experiment that we did, we found that we got about 3,800 professors to evaluate DEI statements about whether or not you'd be allowed to move to the next part of the interview. We found that 52% of people who argued for viewpoint diversity being the kind of diversity they cared about as most important, 52% of them wouldn't have made it to the next level, just to be, wouldn't even have garnered an interview. We talk about the conformity gauntlet, which just gets worse by the day. This is a chapter in the book that, I don't want to take up too much time, that I recommend you read. And just to give you some more historical parallels, I started after 9/11. After 9/11, from 2001 to about 2006, there were 17 attempts to get professors punished for their opinions about 9/11 or the Iraq War. That's bad, by the way. 17 is bad. There were 3 firings, all of which actually were justified by reasons that aren't actually academic freedom. For Ward Churchill, it was gross academic misconduct, which he really did. For Samuel Arian, who was defending him, my first time on TV was defending Samuel Arian, it was actually his ties to Islamic Jihad, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, that actually led to him being indicted for it, that led to him being fired. And the third case involved somebody spending a substantial portion of their technical writing class talking about her opinions on the Iraq War. Definitely a closer call, but still, it's something that you can't be fired for under existing First Amendment law. So, 3 firings, bad period. For scholars under fire, we talk about 1,000 different targets and almost 200 people fired. Now, I'm tired of people saying that this is not a large number. It just shows that they don't actually know anything about the history of academic freedom. So historical parallels, as we try to, we give an impression of like, this is 9/11, which is a lot of times referred to, and most recently in Politico, as like the last bad time for free speech on campus. No, the last bad time for free speech on campus was last year. Actually, it's this year so far. But in this case, like this is the percentage of people targeted for 9/11. This is the number for people targeted under cancel culture. And just to add a little bit more to it, right towards the end of McCarthyism, there was a massive study done, and about 9% of professors were saying they were self-censoring in their papers. And that's, by the way, again, a really bad number. That's 1 in 10 professors saying that they are self-censoring. And what is it when we updated it today? Now, these aren't perfect comparisons because we also asked here for things like, are you self-censoring on social media? Obviously, social media didn't exist back then. But now 91% of professors are saying that they are self-censoring. And to be clear, for that tepid argument that essentially, oh, well, self-censoring is good, they're just being polite. No, the way the question is worded is, are you self-censoring your actual political opinions? Which is not the same thing as just being nice. So forgive me if I sound a little exasperated by this. It has been about 6 years of the worst climate for academic freedom and free speech I've seen in my career. I'm not sure it actually can be fixed overall, given how bad it's actually gotten on campus. But the weirdness of actually spending all day for the last week, and that's where I'm immediately leading to, explaining that, yes, it's a bad moment for free speech on campus, but it's been that way for a long time. Welcome to the party. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Well, I hope everyone is not as pessimistic. Otherwise, this conference will phase out by lunch. Our next speaker is Jonathan Zimmerman at the University of Pennsylvania, one of the leading educational historians in the country. I know he's also a consummate academic because when I talked to him about participating, what he's responded by quizzing me about what high school I went to and what life was in high school, getting empirical evidence for his academic work. So I was very impressed. A former Peace Corps volunteer and high school teacher, he's written for most of the newspapers and is an active public intellectual and defender of free speech. And we look forward to his discussion about what institutions do that relate to free speech. Thank you.
Yeah, on the high school thing, this is something my daughters hated when they were coming up. I would just ask people where they were from and where they went to high school. They're like, Dad, why do you do that? They're so awkward. And the reason, of course, is that I'm a historian, right? When Marshall told me that he went to Forest Hills High School, that meant something very meaningful to me. Because what I'm interested in are the communities that shape us. Anyway, thank you so much to Marshall and to AG and to Dean Payne for organizing all of this and for including me. During his remarks, AG said that we've gathered the best minds in the profession, which of course made me wonder why I was here. In this fabulous location, I mean, I feel like I'm in Perry Mason, but I mean the old Perry Mason, right? Not the new one. And also, thanks to Greg for his great presentation and all the work that FIRE does, which has been hugely useful to me. Every summer I meet with the FIRE interns, and it is the best day of the summer. Greg and his staff assemble a great group of young people, not all from the elite schools, which I really appreciate. Anyway, what can I add here? I mean, one of the problems, one of the dangers in an environment like this is preaching to the converted, which I hate. But I do think since October 7th, what we've seen, at least for me, what's been highlighted are a couple of really important trends. I think some of which Greg alluded to and some of which are possibly a little different. The first one that I would identify is that we are all Marxists now, but not in the way you think, not in the Karl Marx way. So if you look at right-wing media, you'll see that we're full of Marxist indoctrinators, and this is actually false. Going back to Neil Gross, people have surveyed the opinions of professors in recent years, and like Greg said, we're overwhelmingly on the left, but we are not Marxists. Most of us aren't even self-identified progressives. We're Democrats with a capital D. Greg is right in some places that there are more Marxists than conservatives, but that's just because there are so few conservatives. So we're not all Marxists in that way. We're Marxists in a different way, not the Karl Marx, but another Marx who was much more important in my family, who is, of course, Groucho Marx. It was Karl Marx who said, works of the world unite, you have nothing to lose but your chains, from each according to their abilities to each according to their needs. But Groucho Marx said something I think much more profound, which is, if you don't like my principles, I've got others. And it's in that sense, since October 7th, that we've seen that almost all of us are Marxists now. So on the left, you have people that were busily telling us for 20 or 30 years that we have to erect speech codes to prevent this thing called hate. And suddenly they're like sounding the tocsin for the free speech rights of Palestinians and their supporters who want to say from the river to the sea, or glory to our martyrs. Let me be absolutely clear about where I stand. I think all that's protected and should be. But it rings a little hollow from people that were telling us how we had to regulate all this hate speech for those same people to be saying, oh, we've got to protect the free speech rights of that. Meanwhile, people on the right, or you might even say the center right, who are pointing out, I think accurately, that many of our campuses were inimical to free speech, are actually suggesting that we censor the river to the sea and the glory of the martyrs, or ban the Students for Justice in Palestine. It's like, dude, you were the one complaining about the low quality of free speech on the campus, and now you want to censor it? Like, really? So it's in that sense, I think, that what we've learned, the first thing we've learned since October 7th, is we really are all Marxists now. Like, could we just be consistent once, just once? I think the answer is pretty clear, no. Like, we just can't be. The inconsistency has been radical, and it has been on every side of the political spectrum, every side. Secondly, what we've learned is that our universities are now completely psychologized. What that means is our universities are engaged directly and explicitly in the emotional management of their students, their staff, and their faculty. So, at an institution like mine, which did not score very well on the free speech rankings, by the way, the very first thing we did post-October 7th is we held healing circles. Healing circles, at which, by the way, we were instructed not to share anything political. It's like the whole effing thing is political. I mean, come on. And also, aren't we supposed to be political? Like, aren't we supposed to learn something from this moment about the deep complexities of the Mideast crisis? Again, the answer is no. No. What we're supposed to do is manage the emotions of the people on the campus. And of course, this is very hard to square with any kind of commitment to free speech, because speech just hurts. It just does. It's not going to make you feel good. And by the way, if since October 7th you're not emotional about something, or you feel good about anything, you might be a sociopath. I mean, we all feel bad. You should feel bad about something in your way. But the idea that the institutions are supposed to make us feel better. And of course, this ran through all the debate about the statements, right? The statements are supposed to heal us. They're supposed to make us feel better. And there is something so juvenile and infantilizing about this. Let me say that, obviously on my campus, this has been a hugely, hugely contested matter. I don't want to get into the weeds on it, but I just should say I've met Liz McGill exactly 2 times. She seems like a very reasonable person, nice person to me. I feel badly for her. And most of all, I'm just flummoxed and baffled and outraged by the idea that what she says is going to make us feel better, or even matters. I mean, I like Liz McGill. I don't give a shit what she says about Israel-Palestine. I really don't. It's not her line of expertise, but how many people do? And here's where we get into like the combination of emotional management and a weird sort of hero worship, almost talismanic. Oh, great goddess McGill, say the magic word that will make us feel better. She can't, she won't, she shouldn't. But again, massive inconsistency on this front as well. Look, I take the point of Jewish groups and others who said, now hold on, during George Floyd, you're releasing a million statements saying how horrible this is. You said all the DACA stuff and the wall stuff was horrible. Shouldn't you say this is horrible too? I take that point, but again, those were some of the same people who were complaining during George Floyd about this like infinite regressive statements. It's like, dude, now you want another one? Like, I thought you were telling me there were too many, right? Can't we once be consistent? Answer, no. So that's the second thing about, emotional management and all the hypocrisy surrounding Calvin and the statements. And then last, this might be a place where perhaps I can add something original. I think beneath a lot of what Greg and others have described, and beneath the free speech problem on campus, is something deeper, which has to do with the lack of respect and the lack of institutional value that's placed on teaching. This is something I can talk about because I wrote a book on the history of college teaching. Incidentally, if you read that book, you may be the first person who's not a blood relative to do so, because it came out during the pandemic. Then again, we might be related, because Americans often are, but we don't like to talk about that either. And by the way, the very first book that I wrote many, many years ago, there was this publisher's clearinghouse where you could, type in your IBSN number, like the publication number, and it would allegedly tell you your sales. And being a naif, being a much younger man, I actually did that, and I punched in the numbers, and I got the computer voice, and it says, good morning, you have sold 0 books today. And that wasn't getting me any closer to God, and I haven't done it since. But should you read this book, you'll discover that its title is The Amateur Hour. And there's been, insofar as like 3 people have read the book, there's been some controversy around the subject or the title, because people interpret it as saying that amateurs are bad. Not necessarily. The best gymnast in my youth was Nadia Comaneci, and she was an amateur because back then everyone in the Olympics was. So calling teaching the amateur hour doesn't mean that teaching is always bad. Sometimes it's fantastic. What it means is that we don't have professional systems to evaluate it. So when I wrote that book, I didn't submit it to my undergraduates to get their view of the manuscript. Right? I submitted it to other historians of higher education who had the knowledge and the background to hopefully evaluate it in an informed and fair way. That's what we do not do with teaching, right? I should be clear that I'm a supporter of student evaluations. I think they can tell us some important things. Just to take some obvious examples, does the professor return written work in a timely way? It turns out that's hugely important to learning. All of us know this, right? We remember from our youth getting a paper 8 weeks later. You don't remember what you said. You don't care about it anymore. That's one example. Does the professor make herself or himself available outside of class? Also something very important to learning. And both of these examples are things that students can judge very accurately. They're more or less binaries, and the students know, and we should know what they think. But is this an academically useful or valid class? Or did I learn a lot from this class? We're very poor judges of that, especially the latter one. It turns out you can think you learned a lot and you didn't, or you can think you learned very little and you did. But this is where we live. So at my last job at NYU, I was fortunate enough to receive the university's Distinguished Teaching Award, which is, as I say in the preface to that book, it's the highest honor of my life, far and away. And there was this lovely dinner, and my parents were there, and I was thinking about this morning because we're coming on the 6th anniversary of my father's death, which in my ethno-religious tradition is called Yahrzeit. It's kind of a big deal. But he was there, my wife and kids were there, and my dean gets up to introduce me, and I look at the lectern, and I look at her notes, and she's reading a list of the books I wrote. At a ceremony that is supposed to celebrate my teaching. But what else was she supposed to go on, really? I don't begrudge her that, right? She had nothing other than that. So it's not a criticism of her, it's a criticism of us. In the book, when I talk about are different phases, different periods where students protested all of this. They protested the low value and the low quality of teaching. The big beginning is the 1920s, because if you know anything about the period, you know that's when the universities metastasized, right? I mean, that's when they got huge, largely because women were going in big numbers for the first time. So at the University of Michigan, if you read the Michigan Daily, you read people saying like, okay, I was in a lecture hall that was supposed to fit 90. There were 300 people there. Most of them were sitting outside the lecture hall, and there was a dude up there mumbling into a mic that I couldn't hear. Why am I here? Like, what is this? And Wesleyan University sponsored a America-wide student conference on the poor quality of teaching, with representatives from 50 different institutions. Yeah, this actually happened. And you see other iterations of it in the 1960s. Something I've found reason to bemoan is that, we haven't seen a lot of student protest around this issue. I mean, if you quote the N-word from a James Baldwin novel, people will get extremely upset, right? But if you, blow off your classes, or like we did at Penn, bring the students back and then not teach them in person. Just going to say that again. We brought the students back and then we didn't teach them in person, right? No protest. It's a win-win, right? Like, right? I don't have to go to class, right? The students can just tune in their PJs. They get to be with their friends in every sense, right? But of course, this makes absolutely no sense because class is the one place where we can actually monitor their behavior and their masking. I've been doing this for 40 years. I've never seen a couple make out in my class, all right? Maybe I haven't been looking carefully enough, right? But of course, that's what happens in the dorms. So we bring them back to the dorms and let them do that. But we don't have them go to class, and nobody gives a shit. This happened. What have we done about this? Oh, we made centers for teaching and learning, of course. And you know what that is? That's an acknowledgement of how lame we are. If we took it seriously, we wouldn't need that, right? So it's like if you go to a new town and you see a restaurant and it says authentic Chinese food, it's not authentic, right? It's one of these things that means the inverse. And when I was researching the history of all this, I was up at Colby College, like lovely little shishi liberal arts place in central Maine, and they made a center for teaching and learning because everybody did, and this is in the early 90s. And I'm reading letters, which is what historians do. We just read people's mail. And this one older professor, and I'm sure he was like younger than I am now, he's looking at this proposal for a CTL, a Center for Teaching and Learning, and he writes, a Center for Teaching and Learning. Isn't that what Colby College is? And the answer, of course, is no. Or teaching awards, right? You want to not get tenure at Harvard? Get a teaching award. Right? Because the first couple people that got teaching awards all got dinged. Seriously, how serious a scholar could you be, right? If 18-year-olds could actually understand or give a shit about what you're saying. You must be such a facile popularizer, right? This is a mark against you. Also, the incentives are all effed up, right? Because everybody knows that by publishing another book, right, you can actually get promoted and increase your base salary. Right? The teaching awards are just a one-off. I mean, I've gotten them. I'll take the $1,000. I'm not going to complain, right? But that's a joke, right? I mean, that's a joke in the sense if what you're saying is this is really going to address the problem. So what does that have to do with anything that Greg said or anything we're talking about today? I actually think it has a lot to do with it. If you're not invested in the moral formation of young people, all the stuff on Greg's slides are going to be a lot less important to you. They may not even matter at all. Okay, the students are self-censoring, right? And they're not talking about the things that matter to them. I think that means they're not going to learn as much. But if you don't care about learning, why would you care about that? So this seems to me to be one of the great elephants in the room. The reason I'm only going to go to part of the second session and then run right back to Philadelphia is I teach at 3. And I wasn't going to miss that for this. I believe in this, but I believe in that more. Thanks a lot.
I want to start with asking my colleagues this question, and it maybe derives from the insight about emotional management at the university. There seems to be an increasing sense of students that they're entitled to feel comfortable at universities. Maybe because they pay $60,000, $80,000 a year.
Yeah.
But this sense of feeling comfortable is one of their biggest complaints against speech, which they disagree with.
Right.
And I was wondering how this sense of the right to feel comfortable developed and how one deals with it now.
This is a coddling of the American mind question.
Yeah. So I'm the co-author of a book called, you can hear me, right? Coddling in the American Mind with my friend Jonathan Haidt. And the primary argument I started making in 2014 was something I've been thinking about since I was hospitalized as a danger to myself for my own depression and anxiety in 2007. which, by the way, was overwhelmingly because of the frustration of being in the culture war 24 hours a day. What I was saying was it seemed like adults on college campuses were teaching people what are called cognitive distortions, which are mental exaggerations like catastrophizing, overgeneralizing, emotional reasoning, which means that every emotion represents something that you immediately understand in the real world that must be responded to, binary thinking, either everything is perfect or everything is terrible, mind reading, which means that you know that people are out to get you, like I said, overgeneralizing as well. But basically, they're teaching the whole list. And usually by example, not usually by actually saying do catastrophize, although there is some of that as well. But thankfully the students weren't listening. And around 2014, we started noticing that a lot more students were showing up and demanding deplatforming, demanding new speech codes, based on quasi-medical justifications that more or less that were based in cognitive distortions. Things that will make you depressed and will make you anxious if you believe in this. Now, we said this in 2014. We wrote the article. Article came out in 2015, and the situation for mental health got 1,000,000 times worse after 2015. We thought we were going to see a little scholarly dip in mental health, and instead we saw an absolute plunge in terms of mental health. So the version of the argument that says part of the problem with higher education is it's a incredibly wealthy, incredibly influential mega corporation industry that likes to pretend it's the underdog, but they also believe that the customer is always right, we address that in Colleague American Mind. We think the corporatization of higher ed has had some serious drawbacks. But the idea that the focus on the major sin of higher education is focusing too much on student comfort, I take some issue with, because I think if they were really concerned about student comfort, they wouldn't be teaching them to catastrophize, to engage in binary thinking, to engage in these things that are pretty much guaranteed to make sure that they are anxious and depressed. And the final caveat here, and the thing that frustrates me the most, is that, and I didn't emphasize this in coddling, is in a lot of cases these bad mental habits are taught in the name of a theory that essentially if you make people sufficiently upset about the state of the world, it will help them fix it. Forgive the expression, but that's bullshit. Anxious and depressed people don't change the world. They tend to either hide from it or recommend solutions that actually either can't work. They tend to become hopeless, not hopeful. So I think that a lot of what we're doing, if we really did care about mental health, we're sure not showing it in the way we're raising our kids.
Yeah, the only thing I'd add to that is I think that the awareness of mental health is a fantastic thing. The problem is the misinformation surrounding it, and it transcends the question of free speech. Taking everything what Greg said, I think is right, but at the same time, think about what's happened at our universities regarding deadlines since 2020. So I think with the best of intentions, I never question anybody's motives. A lot of administrators and professors have encouraged us to take our foot off the gas and show much more leniency to our students with respect to deadlines and other kinds of academic requirements. And I think they do believe that that will help the mental health of the students. They just happen to be wrong.
Yes.
There's an enormous literature about procrastination and mental health. As you might expect, it's a little complicated to figure out where the causal hours go, which causes which, but there's no question that they're associated. Absolutely none. So how are we helping people's mental health if we allow them to procrastinate? We are just not. We are doing the opposite, but we're being encouraged to do that. Not by bad people, because I don't think these people are bad. I think just with the best of intentions, they've misinterpreted what we know about mental health. The problem is an awareness of mental health. It's the misinterpretation of it.
And nowhere is this more true with regards to trigger warnings. One of the things we pointed out back in 2014 was, given standard psychological analysis and cognitive behavioral therapy theory, essentially trigger warnings will create 4 very predictable things. We could say 4 very predictable things about trigger warnings. One, that there's very little reason to think these would help. This is essentially like playing scary music and then telling people not to be anxious. It primes them to be frightened. 2, that it will actually lead more students to think that speech is actually dangerous in a way they might not have previously thought. 3, it will scare the hell out of professors to teach anything that might be controversial, and in the end, it won't actually it won't show any benefit. And all of those have been repeated over and over again in studies. I think we're up to maybe like 10 different studies showing trigger warnings don't work, and yet they are still used very much like an article of faith, even though, for example, Richard McNally established the fact that not only is there no evidence this is helpful, there is some evidence that it's harmful, and it certainly frames speech in a way that actually can make people more hostile to the idea of freedom of speech in the first place.
Also, if I may, if you give people a trigger warning about Anna Karenina for suicide, you're kind of doing a spoiler. just saying. Yeah.
Wait, what?
Yeah.
The audience, yes?
Do we need to use the microphone for the questions, Tom? To capture that? So we need to use the
Wait and
microphone.
talk.
I mean, it's going to be crisp, this mic can pick it up on here, too.
Okay, we'll just not use the microphone.
Just speak loud.
Yes, you got it.
Professor Strauss.
Thank you. Many thanks to Greg and John. I've had the pleasure of hearing you many times, but I always learn from you. I have one comment and one question. The comment really flows from the assignment of the panel I'm on, which is looking at potential solutions. I think the hypocrisy that both of you pointed out should be, for those of us who do our best to neutrally defend free speech, is that we should use this as a teachable moment, not a accusation moment. And my senior fellow at Fire, Jakob Changama, wrote about this early after October 7th, talking about the temptation to punish, mete out on them what they have been meting out on us. And I wrote down the last line in his column. He said, hypocrisy must be fought with principles, not tit for tat. And this is another good example. You mentioned, John, the Calvin principles or institutional neutrality. It is a little bit hard to swallow. Suddenly getting religion on not saying anything about the mass slaughter and torture of Jews when it's been said about everything else. But let's look at this as an opportunity to get institutions that otherwise would not have been looking positively on the Calvin principles to do that. And there seems to have been a groundswell there. Jeff Flyer, the former dean of the Harvard Medical School, who's been very active, especially in Heatherwick House Academy, wrote a wonderful piece in the Chronicle of Higher Education shortly after October 7th, in which he said, I understand the downside, but please let's take advantage of this opportunity. Moving forward, it will be so beneficial. The question that I have is, and then Jonathan, I guess this goes without saying, but you won't be here. One of the strategies for reform that flows from your excellent remarks is that we have to do something more to focus on teaching. And I would say, also on mental health, I assume that that's also an amateur hour phenomenon, that the people who are making these policies don't really know the research about the actual psychological impact. The question that I have flows from the charge for this really, to me, really interesting and almost unique forum, which is specifically focusing on law school. Everything you said, of course, does apply to law schools, among other educational institutions, but is there anything specific about the law school context in terms of these issues that we should be aware of?
Well, let me just say two things. One of the things I found, and maybe this will make the law professors in the room happy when I was doing my research, is that overall teaching at law school tends to be better than in most other parts of the university. Obviously, there's variation within every category. And different people have different theories about why this is, but if you look at the overall literature on teaching, the takeaway is that the best teaching is the kind that engages people in the activity of the discipline, right? So a good history class is one where people have to become historians and do the things that historians do. And in a law school class, I think there's evidence that's more likely to happen, and the law school should feel good about that. However, At the University of Pennsylvania, I have been appalled at how little the law students know about the First Amendment. And you know why? It's not part of con law. It's an elective.
Yeah.
WTF? Like, isn't there a reason it's called the First Amendment? Like, this is Hamlet with the play Hamlet. It's a play Hamlet with Hamlet left out. How could the First Amendment not be part of con law? So everyone's got to take con law, and that's very cool, right? But they don't say the First Amendment. So they'll come to my talks, and they'll be like, and of course, hate speech isn't protected under the Constitution. I'm like, oh, sorry. I mean, if you want to argue it shouldn't be, I'll listen. That's great. But if you're saying that as a matter of law, that's like saying 1 and 1 is 3. It's false. And then I found out that the kid has never studied the First Amendment, and it's not her fault. So that seems to be an enormous problem.
That's just really depressing. Yeah, when it comes to I used to think that law schools had, just like science schools, had some greater level of inoculation against some of the ideological rigidity that you see as a problem, particularly in undergrad. And I still think that's true, but it's not sufficient. And I think that what Jenny Martinez was trying to do and is trying to do at Stanford gives me some amount of hope. You know, one thing that was profoundly disappointing, though, is she tried to put together, after, you know, the shoutdown of Kyle Duncan, you know, that's my alma mater, so I was particularly ashamed of that. I particularly got mad at the classism, like them shouting at this guy that he couldn't have gotten into Stanford. You know, just like, okay, jackasses, we're supposed to hide that aspect of ourselves. But the
Stanford at 0%. Remember that? The
Yeah.
that? Yeah.
That when she tried to do a number of sort of educational forums on First Amendment, academic freedom, free speech, nobody wanted to do them. To teach them in response to, like, you know, shoutdowns are not, and you know, and by the way, shoutdown put together with the help of administration, there's nothing more obvious in the history of anything. Yeah, I mean, it was a 10-minute shoutdown. Dean Steinbach had met with the students for hours in advance, including several other DEI administrators. There was a precisely 10-minute shoutdown. Then she gets up, gives a prepared speech on whether or not the juice of free speech is worth the squeeze. But also saying, is the juice of having a Fifth Circuit judge here worth the squeeze of the pain he apparently caused? Which is like, conservative professors have spoken, judges have spoken at Stanford as long as it's been around. Like, I don't know who exactly is causing the pain here. So the challenge, you know, basically saying that the challenge is really real, but definitely I think rethinking entirely the way we do orientation and the way we do like those first couple days is key. I just don't see a lot of will to actually do that because, you know, students are coming in already hostile to freedom of speech. That's a hard thing to get out of them. So I've been talking to Dean Martinez, now Provost Martinez, a bit about like how you can, but you have to start early and often with these habits. And interestingly, one of the most important habits is not speech, it's listening. So a lot, as a constitutional lawyer, like people assume that I'm immediately going to go the best way to actually teach people about speech is our debates. And I'm like, no, actually the best way to teach people about speech is to be able to listen to and understand someone who has an opinion you hate, explain where they're coming from, which is something that the old free speech left on campuses did wonderfully in many cases. They would show up to speeches of people that would be even like out and out racist, listen to them, and then ask hard questions at the break.
Other questions from the audience in the back, sir? And identify yourself, please.
My name's Dean. I just have a question. I guess it's more or less a jump off both of you. What's the role of that tenure has had in, I guess, sort of inoculating our professors from this kind of cancellation attempts? Because my thinking is that if you got tenure, that's supposed to give you the freedom to express your ideas, to do research that may be verboten by polite society and all that. But in the interest of, you know, furthering our understanding of things, so I would think tenure would be able to, you know, kind of, I guess, tamper down these kind of cancellation attempts. But I guess in your experience, Professor Zimmerman, and I guess in your research, Mr. Lukianoff, what's been the effect of tenure on all of this?
I guess there's three answers to that. One is that tenure has been one of the great disappointments of my career. I came in very convinced of its need, but you need to have tenure in order to protect academic freedom and free speech, and this will embolden professors to be bold and brave in defense of not only their free speech and academic freedom, but their colleagues and their students. That very rarely happens, with exceptions. Of course, people like Randy Kennedy are very brave in this, and Alan Charles Kors is very brave in this, and Eden Strawson is very brave in this, but not, it seems to actually sometimes function as a sort of filter for whether or not how conformist you are to the particular department. Like the long process of actually getting it has been, like I said, one of the great disappointments of my career. On the other hand, I can't help but say I was somewhat darkly amused by the fact that in Texas there was this move against tenure to get them libs, and it's like, you do understand that if you get rid of tenure, some of the people with their necks on the chopping block are going to be conservatives you agree with. That essentially tenure, for allowing dissenting professors to at least still have jobs in higher ed, it has actually played a significant role. But do I think that ultimately future versions of higher ed necessarily would have to have something like that? I think that I've heard suggestions on the idea of having contracts that have strong protections of academic freedom might actually allow for a more fluid situation, a lot more dynamism, where professors are less, they don't, that they're actually more free to actually genuinely express themselves. I mean, it sounds like a joke, but I had a friend get to me, he's like, I was talking to an emeritus professor at a prestigious college. He's in his 80s, and he talked about being, really, once he actually drops out of being emeritus, then he's excited because then he can really speak his mind.
Mm. Well, that's pretty grim. I mean, let me just add a couple things. First of all, as a historian, I should say that this is one of the subjects that people are most confused about and most surprised to learn what actually happened. So students come into your class in higher ed thinking that during the McCarthy period, tenure protected people's academic freedom. It didn't.
It did not.
That's the point of Alan Schrecker's book. It failed its most important stress test. Yep. And I think everyone should realize that. The other thing that I'd say is that, you can tenure people, but they're still going to be conservative. In a dictionary sense. I mean, this is what's so ironic about the language, right? So politically, the vast majority of American professors are somewhere on the left. But man, are we conservative in a dictionary sense. We don't like change. If we change, it's going to be extremely slowly. And also, I think in part, maybe because of the peer review process, we're extremely outer directed, as David Reisman would have said. That is, we take our cues from our tribe, and that makes us conservative because you're kind of paid in your approval, right? Like, that's why I'm here, ultimately, right? And that's why I got tenure, because other people who were also experts in my field thought I was worthy of it. And that does make you conservative. I feel it most acutely when I write a column. I'm also a newspaper columnist, and a colleague, a tenured colleague, will say to me, always sotto, like always on the down low, never officially, God, you really had guts to say that, or some other body part. And my response is always, I don't have guts or the other body part. I've got tenure. Yeah. Like, what the F is it for? Isn't it for that? But we're so conservative that we're scared to step out, right? To step out of anything. Lastly, just one more thing that's really important that has to be a part of this discussion. The vast majority of American professors aren't going to get tenure. Nope. Right? Because they're contingent or adjunct faculty. And that, friends, is the biggest threat to academic freedom in America. If I were an adjunct, I couldn't be here saying what I'm saying, because I would be wondering if the dean was going to rehire me the next time.
And I forgot one very important data point. So I've been doing this 22 years, 23 years next year. And early in my career, professors got in trouble a fair amount, but they very rarely were fired. And almost never did I see a professor who was tenured get fired for their free speech or academic freedom. That 200 professors that I'm talking about, more than 40 of them are tenured professors. Tenure, just like during McCarthyism, is not provided. It's so well known that even on the Netflix show The Chair, they make a joke about like how tenure doesn't protect anyone anymore. So it's like it's not even actually serving its essential function. And the idea that getting rid of it would be a good thing does trouble me, because it would increase the relative power of administrators, which are already a big part of the problem.
We'll take one more question over there.
No, you two first, Tom. Sorry.
Okay, just really quickly, I'm Tom Gensberg from the University of Chicago. Just briefest comment on Calvin. The most important thing about Calvin isn't the university presidents, because as Greg said, no one really cares about that. But the departments.
Yes.
The departments hold actual power over professors and junior faculty, and they announce orthodoxies on things like Israel and Palestine and such. And so I think in talking about Calvin, everyone should be focused on that, because that's the real evil. But my question for you is, this is about causes. I'm not sure I heard either of you mention the social media. John, I loved your thing about Marxists. I sometimes think we need more Marxists in the university, because actual Marxists don't think about it. They think identity is superstructure.
Yes.
But that's not our world. So I wonder if you can, what about identity synthesis, as what calls it, is, I don't know.
That's Joshua Holmes.
It's causes.
Yeah, I mean, look, I mean, on the Marxist front, let me add one other thing. If, as is the case at Penn, about 2/3 of my students are going into either tech or finance or management consulting, if I'm a Marxist indoctriner, I am one lame-ass Marxist indoctriner, right? I am not doing my job at all, I think that, there's so much to say on this topic, and I also take your point, having some real Marxists would be good. But it strikes me that, there's also a kind of arrested development going on in identity politics. Like when I was 19, I really wondered about my identity. Like, who am I in this world? What am I going to do? But now I'm 62 and I kind of got it down, right? And just like that infantile wish for Liz McGill to say the right words, right? I think a lot of the identity stuff, as you get older, it's like a perpetual adolescence. It's like we don't have to wonder that much who we are. We have to think more about what we do. I don't really care who you are. I care about what you do.
So when it comes to the department part, I couldn't agree more. And that as far as actually establishing orthodoxies, and this is something that sometimes First Amendment lawyers don't get about the special environment of higher education, is that you both have to fight for people not to be censored, but you also have to fight the establishment of orthodoxies in knowledge-producing institutions. And that's one of the reasons why Canceling the American Mind focuses almost exclusively on knowledge-producing institutions and how much you damage public trust when you don't actually protect that. So the departments not taking political stances is actually, I think, in some ways more important than presidents not doing it. But if I already believed that until I started hearing horror stories of people in departments who would have their names affixed to departmental positions that they did not share. Including professors at University of Chicago, which I just was absolutely, people would think that doing this so long I wouldn't be shocked anymore, but I'm shocked practically every day.
And just one other thing about identity politics, it's also a great source, of inconsistency, right? So, when Trump said his thing about the Mexican judges, a lot of us were very outraged. Not just because the judge wasn't Mexican, by the way, which he wasn't, right? He was Mexican-American, he was born in the United States, just like me. But I think more fundamentally, we were outraged because of the syllogism that Trump was implying, right? That because of this guy's ethnicity or race, he wasn't going to be able to render a fair decision, right? Because, his ethnicity and race is overwhelmingly governing what he thinks and says. But then you go to a seminar and people are like, as a Ukrainian, as a heterosexual Jewish man who's 62, ... And the logic or illogic is exactly the same. You begin with your identity, and what you're communicating to your students is that identity is not just going to be formative, but it's going to be determinative in what you're going to say after that. And that's what we're taking Trump to task for, but we do it ourselves.
I think we're going to have to stop for a coffee break. Make it short, please, so we can get maybe 10 minutes so we can get back on schedule. And we'll have time, I know, in my panel for your questions.
Very good.
I'm thinking that